good had a good first after day. Would it come out again? Every day, and the pleasure of the day. Had a good had I myself. It's all the while, passing from me. The fall of the sky, where the lonely begin. All good things, like a river rolling to this. Endless rolling to this. Down at the top, gathered in the legions of mine, for some new fire. Regions of mine, broken and died. Moment of time. Like a river flowing to the end. I just flowing to the end. Even when the angels disappeared in our thoughts, your face like you goes in the dark. But I want you to remember, oh, I will teach you all good, all good, all good. Got it complete. Smells that the day, will it come around to me? The bills will be paid, and the pleasure will be all good. Got it all good, all good, all good. Got it. Freedom. Toyota hybrids say, let go. Paid a person $50,000 generations. Coverage is subject to terms and conditions. And warranties, notice, warranty, and maintenance time for details. Any minute now. Ship is coming in. chase the horizon. I'll stand on the ground, feel the wave come crashing down, down, down on me. And you say, be still, my love. Open up your heart, let the light shine up. Don't you understand? I already have a plan. Waiting for my real life to begin. I won't stay. Suddenly, nothing happened. But in my dream, I see the dragon down the path. It's trouble. The conference call is now ending. Oh, oh, deep water. And cold like the night. Standing bars wide open. I run a twisted, a stranger in the eyes of the maker. Could not see for the fog in my eyes. Could not feel for the feel in my life. From across the great
Ipsy is now joining your meeting. 11 other participants.
walking to me with the maker. My body is bent and broken. But I can work beyond the labor end. Turn my head away. A stranger in the hands of the maker.
Good afternoon. Our YouTube stream should be working now, so if people want to listen on that, and you're welcome to listen in here too. If it starts to get garbled here, the YouTube stream should be working.
Thanks, Maria. Was that a big fix, or was there an update to be done or something?
I'm not sure. We're using a variety of software and to run these meetings. So, anytime one of the companies does an update, it might throw off a setting or two on other things, just like how everybody's individual computers are. So, it's really hard to tell, but we should have it working now.
Great. Well, thanks for working on that.
Hey, John, if you wanted to call in directly, if you don't have the phone wizard, I'm putting it in the chat box right there. Go ahead and give a call and we'll merge you.
Can you hear me?
I got it now. I got it. I'm on.
Okay, great.
Oh,
Sometimes it's just it just might be a matter of, depending on what your internet speed is for it to get connected.
Okay, Council, please come back to order. We are on public testimony for agenda item D2, sablefish trawl overages, at a request from members of the public to testify out of order. So we'll take up Megan Williams.
Hi, can you hear me?
Good afternoon. We can. Good afternoon.
Great. Thank you so much. I appreciate your time. My name is Megan Williams, and I'm testifying on behalf of Ocean Conservancy, and I'll very briefly address the issue of sablefish overages. Sablefish bycatch overages in the Bering Sea and Gulf of Alaska trawl fleet do represent a conservation concern, and these overages are counter to the Magnuson-Stevens Act requirement to minimize bycatch under National Standard 9. We support the AP motion and an expanded discussion paper to address these overages. The North Pacific Fishery Management Council has a tradition of ecosystem and science-based fisheries management. Chronic bycatch issues and overages fly directly in the face of this longstanding reputation. As we've discussed, climate change is altering the baseline as we know it and will necessitate managers and fishers think proactively about equity and sustainability as species distributions and productivities change. Precautionary management requires that ADCs and TAC overages are not taken lightly, and these are management reference points designed to buffer fish stocks and fishery participants from uncertainty. While the D2 discussion paper does address some mitigation solutions, there are still gaps in our knowledge that can be addressed with more thorough analyses. Fortunately, we are a data-rich region with observer and industry data collected at very high resolution, and this is really an asset. Important questions to ask in another discussion paper include, for instance, how does month or depth or even temperature play into bycatch rates across the fleet? Another important question is, how do the bycatch rates vary across target species or fleet? So an expanded understanding of the issue will support a more useful and effective discussion of measures to mitigate bycatch. Incentive programs, potentially, and or stand-downs based on a bycatch rate, so for instance, non-target to target species ratio, holds promise and warrants more consideration for sablefish and potentially for other bycatch species in the future. The magnitude of the trawl fleet should not exempt it from the MSA mandate to minimize bycatch. Advancing ecosystem-based fishery management in the North Pacific requires innovative approaches and progressive management that consider ecosystem function and equity between user groups. At the end of the day, we feel this is a conservation issue that goes beyond sablefish in scope and highlights the need for improved mitigation tools to minimize bycatch in the Alaska region. And that's all I have. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Ms. Reyes. Are there any questions? Okay, thank you for your testimony. Okay, John Gruber. Following Mr. Gruber will be Beth Concepcion and then Hannah Heimbuck.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. You hear me okay?
We can. Good afternoon.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the council. For the record, I'm John Gruber with United Catcher Boats, and I am the intercooperative manager for the AFA Catcher Vessel Cooperatives, and also the IPA representative for the inshore salmon agreement. The discussion paper does a good job of describing the issues that led up to the overages by the trawl sectors in 2020. Does a thorough review of the tools that are available to reduce sablefish incidental catch and explains the consequences of their implementation as well. That's an important point. As stated in the paper, the Bering Sea pollock cooperatives are effective at reducing salmon bycatch. The cooperatives also focus on reducing herring bycatch as well. The AFA Catcher Vessel pollock cooperatives hold Chinook avoidance as their highest bycatch reduction priority, followed by chum salmon and then herring. Those PSC species will always take the precedence in the bycatch reduction toolbox that the cooperatives have. That doesn't mean that avoiding sablefish wasn't a consideration in the 2020 B season, but avoiding the PSC species to the extent practical is always a priority. In the 2020 B season, the pollock catcher vessel fleet certainly could have lowered their sablefish bycatch, but it would have come at a cost of significantly higher Chinook salmon bycatch, as you heard Mr. Haflinger discuss previously. Chum salmon and herring PSC would have also been higher. And based on the previous comments by the council to the industry, Chinook salmon avoidance is the number one priority for the pollock fleet to avoid. In recent years, as indicated in the paper, the sablefish incidental catch was all but non-existent until 2018 and has risen steadily over the last 4 years in lockstep with the recent record increases in sablefish biomass. The paper points out that the increase in sablefish incidental catch has not had a negative impact on the sablefish stocks. It goes on to point out that the area apportionment of sablefish is not representative of the true distribution of the sablefish population, unlike as occurs in other groundfish species where the area limits are based on survey results. The bottom line is that the area apportionment of sablefish more closely represented, if the area apportionment of sablefish more closely represented the true distribution of sablefish, the 2020 TAC overages most likely would have fallen within an area TAC in the Bering Sea and in the Central Gulf. Based on the details brought out in the paper, I would ask the council to drop sablefish trawl overages from the agenda. That said, if the sablefish trawl overage agenda item is to continue with an expanded discussion paper as requested by the AP, then that expanded discussion paper should include a deeper dive into the impacts of setting an ABC well below the maximum ABC associated with an area apportionment not based on the actual distribution of sablefish. I'd ask that a table be included in the expanded discussion paper, if that is the will of the council, covering 1, the maximum ABCs and adopted ABCs for the 6 sablefish subareas, the fixed 2013 subarea apportionment amounts compared to the 5-year non-exponentially weighted subarea apportionments would have been had that been the tool used to do subarea apportionments. And 3, trawl TAC amounts and overage amounts for each year for the trawl sectors included in that table. Given the continued use of a fixed apportionment approach for distribution of subareas through the 2020, the purpose of the table is to demonstrate whether the trawl overages would have occurred in the subarea ABC if the subarea ABC apportionment methodology had accurately reflected the distribution of the sablefish population as would have been done under the previously used 5-year non-exclusively weighted calculation. You'll recall that in 2013, the Council adopted a fixed area apportionment, which was fine for stabilizing the fishery at the time, but failed to take into account this recent increase in sablefish population. I'd also ask that you include a detailed look into the reliance of the catcher vessel fishery has on the horseshoe fishing grounds, where the majority of the 2020 beach season sablefish catch occurred. This should include, but not limited to, the quantity of pollock harvest from the area and the product value created by fish that come from an area located as close to the shore plants as the horseshoe is. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, and those are my comments.
Thank you for your testimony, Mr. Gruber. Any questions? Don't see any. All right.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for your time. Next up is Beth Concepcion.
Hi, Mr. Chair. Can you hear me?
We can. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and members of the Council. My name is Beth Concepcion, and I am the Operations Manager for the Alaska Seafood Cooperative, otherwise known as the Amendment 80 Fleet. We have 5 member companies and 20 catcher processor vessels. I'm here today to speak to what the Amendment 80 Fleet has done in terms of Bering Sea sablefish management, starting in 2019 when catch started to drastically increase. Sablefish for us has mostly been a bycatch species in our deep water flats fisheries, although we have been able to target it in the past. Since 2019, NMFS has put sablefish on bycatch status at the beginning of the year, which means we cannot target but can retain up to the MRA. As stated in the document, for many of our species, the MRA is 1%. By regulation, anything over the MRA must be discarded. In the summer of 2019, our vessels started seeing significant increases in sablefish on the ground. As catch started to increase, we implemented a sablefish Google group for all of our vessels. Any catch of Bering Sea sablefish was to be immediately sent to the group with date, time, location, and depth. Vessels would give increased attention to their tow composition and report any sablefish seen. If sablefish catch exceeded a certain threshold, we would convene a call with all the member companies. Sablefish was put on our weekly cooperative report, and additional updates were sent out as needed. Starting in 2020, we had very similar protocols, but expanded to include notification prior to participating in any of the deepwater flat species. Vessels were required to do smaller test tows in any new areas, to alert the Google group on any tow more than a couple metric tons, and to make necessary movements with respect to depth, area, and time to allow for reduction in sablefish rates. At a co-op level, catch was monitored throughout the week. Updates were sent frequently to the fleet on sablefish catch. Hotspots were continuously looked for, and weekly meetings were held with all members to review the effectiveness of the mitigation measures in place. Frequent contact was made with NMFS in season throughout the year to make sure they knew what our fishing effort was going to be and to stay up to date on recent catch amounts and rates for all sectors. These same protocols are currently in place for 2021. In 2019, our sablefish catch was just under 1,300 tons, and in 2020, just over 1,000 tons, roughly a 17% reduction in catch. To date, we have caught around 150 tons less sablefish than we did by the same time last year. As in previous years, and as can be seen in the document, sablefish was seen all over the Bering Sea shelf with no reprieve on area or time. We are seeing the same so far in 2021. As was well stated in the document, our vessels are constantly doing a fine balancing act on a daily basis to allow them to prosecute their fisheries throughout the year. Sablefish is just one of the many species we are trying to avoid and or closely monitor. We have hard caps on all of our Amendment 80 species, as well as 5 PSC species, which consist of crab and halibut. Cod is also very constraining for us, so vessels are constantly doing cost-benefit analyses, particularly in the summer when yellowfin full spawned, and fishing opportunities are quite different per member company. As we do with all species that are of concern, we will continue to aggressively monitor sablefish catches, Our vessels will continue to make movements as needed, and we will be as responsive as we can to the changing sablefish biomass. Thank you for your time, and that concludes my testimony.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Concepcion. Let's see if there's any questions. Ms. Baker.
Thank you for your testimony. I do want to just clarify something. I think a point that was implicit in your testimony, but I just want to check. You did provide us with the catch of sablefish from Amendment 80 vessels for 2019, 2020, and then an estimate thus far this year in 2021 compared to the same time in the previous year. And so given the fact that those numbers appear to be going down, that would imply that the measures that you've implemented at a cooperative level that you described to us, the fleet is responding to those. There are things that you're learning about the encounters and things you might be able to do to avoid sablefish or at least reduce encounters. Am I sort of taking away the right message from the information that you gave us?
Through the chair, Ms. Baker, you're correct. We're doing everything we can to minimize our sablefish bycatch. That being said, we are still seeing it all over the shelf. So our vessels are moving, whether it's by depth or by area. And so as much as I would like to say that our awesome management protocols are working great, I think a lot of it has to do with luck and where it shows up. And we haven't seen any sort of difference between time of year or depth. And specifically in 2020, we could be fishing the same spot for several tows and then get hit with, a huge 8-ton tow or something. And we didn't do anything different. And then so our vessels would then move. So we're doing everything we can to really mitigate any sablefish bycatch.
Thank you for that. I really appreciate that response. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Ms. Baker. Mr. Down.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much, Beth. I wanted to ask you a question on these. You have these weekly meetings and mitigation measures that are. You mentioned that you would measure the effectiveness of these mitigation measures and discuss that. So, could you tell me what some of those mitigation, how do you measure the effectiveness of this? You said some of this is locked, but you're moving, you're doing some things. I'm guessing those are the area and time sensitive stuff. That's what you're discussing. But the measure of the effectiveness of the mitigation measures, I was interested in how well you're really able to capture that.
Thanks. Excuse me. Thank you, Mr. Chair, Mr. Down. So in our weekly meetings, I basically did a rundown of where every vessel was fishing, how much fish had been caught to date. I discussed what I had been discussing with nymphs in season. They were on speed dial. So I spoke with them multiple times throughout the year. And then every company would kind of say, this is what we're doing. This is our plan for the next couple of days. This is what we're doing. And so that was really the gist of these meetings, and to see really if everybody was following through with the requirements that we had set in place. So I hope that answers your question.
It does answer my question, and I could, I'm just looking at your catch of sablefish 2019, 2020, and 2021, and appreciate that you've been able to keep that pretty stable and maybe even dropping a little bit. So I think that something you're doing is working. I hope it's not all just luck, as you said. So, Mr. Chairman, thank you. I just wanted to mention to Ms. Concepcion that I appreciate your testimony here. This is, from my perspective as a council member, this is the best report that we've got on stable fish mitigation measures from anybody in the industry yet. So I really appreciate what you're doing here and to the degree that you were able to drill down on the effectiveness of some of this stuff. Thank you.
Ms. Kimball.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Ms. Concepcion. I'm having trouble opening what Mr. Downs is looking at, but I just wondered if you could let me know, is the majority of your stable fish bycatch taken in what's essentially the B season, like from kind of June on? Or do you typically in the Amendment 80 sector see a lot of stable fish bycatch also in the A season? I don't believe your seasons are set up that way, but I think you know what I'm talking about.
Yes, through the chair, Ms. Kimball. So our deep water flats fisheries open May 1. So we start seeing stable fish catch May 1. The majority of the catch does, however, seem to come past the June 10th time frame. And but it really just depends on how much effort is in there, at the beginning versus later on in the year.
Thank you.
Any further questions? Thanks again for your testimony.
Thank you.
Hannah Heimbuck, then Teresa Peterson, and then Alexander Stubb.
Hi there. Can you hear me?
We can. Good afternoon.
Wonderful. Good afternoon, everyone. Hannah Heimbuck, testifying again for the under 60 cod harvesters. For the last few years, we've strongly supported developing management mechanisms that can address harvest overages with a focus on the stable fish overages in the trawl TV sector. I think anytime we lack tools to manage to establish allocations, it's a kind of a fundamental problem, whether or not a person thinks that additional removals in any particular case are significant. As you've heard from many of the fixed-gear sector over the years, they do think this is significant, but either way, I think this is a clear management issue. And so we support the AP motion that recommends an expanded discussion paper for their developing tools to manage catch to established allocations. And in particular, we support the AP recommendation to expand this paper to examine how any accountability measures developed could be applied to overages occurring in PCOD. This is considering the very similar management challenge we're seeing in the ASA-CP sector, as we discussed earlier this week under the trawl program. As I previously testified, to date, that fleet has harvested 186% of its PCOD allocation. This is a 4.4 million pound overage that will be covered via reallocations from the trawl C season again. And like 2020, eliminates what would otherwise be fall fishing opportunity for directed cod fisheries and accelerates the closure of the PCOD fishery in the Bering Sea with further impacts to other sectors. It seems appropriate to ensure any management options developed to address excessive stable fish overages should also be examined to apply to PCOD, particularly considering the immediate impact that PCOD overages have on other sectors. And just to emphasize that, preempting directed fall cod fisheries and accelerating the Bering Sea closure is pretty significant downstream impact to us and to others. And as you heard from a previous testifier representing another PCOD sector, we also understand the complexity of including both in one paper. I know that's difficult. I would say our priority is that the issue is addressed and soon, but recognize the council may need to decide exactly how they want to do that. Beyond the current in-season impact, not addressing the cause of PCOD overages could potentially lead to a conservation or an exacerbated management concern in future years if harvest exceeds the quotas available to cover it. For instance, if the trawl sea season is fully utilized, does the jig quota then roll to cover overages? I just think we need to consider what this could look like unaddressed. And I think debating what is or isn't a conservation concern or examining adjusting tax or ABCs or OFLs doesn't actually address the inherent flaw of a program that lacks the ability to manage to an established allocation. I think that should really be the focus going forward. Again, we support the overall intent of the AP motion to continue to develop tools to prevent those overages, whether that's an expanded discussion paper or an analysis. I really appreciate the discussion about NIMS contributing input to whatever that next step is that would help to better flesh out the specific management accountability measures the council wants to pursue. I think that could be really helpful. And in particular, I think time and area closures, perhaps based on intercept rates when harvest approach or exceed limits, and investigating options to apply on a sector or a co-op specific level is one of the more straightforward approaches that should be further examined. It sounds like, at least in the case of the previous testifier, some fleet members have begun gathering information and developing communication systems that support both further avoidance and understanding those encounters. I think that's great. Perhaps the fleet hasn't drawn any conclusions from that yet, but I think that information sounds pretty useful and is an indication that the fleet could respond to incentives, perhaps in the form of rate-based phased time and area closures, to further develop and use that information they're gathering in season. I just think any of those productive industry efforts really need to be met with a management effort that gets us closer to our shared goal here. Thanks so much for your time and the opportunity to comment. This is an important one to us, and I hope we can take another step forward here, both for stablefish and for peacock. I just appreciate the thought and consideration. Thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Heimbach. Any questions from council members? Mr. Down, I think that's an old hand raised. Let me know if not. Ms. Kimball.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Ms. Heimbach. I appreciate your testimony in saying, regardless of whether you think it's a conservation concern or not, it is a management issue. And I'm wondering, given your support of the AP motion, which of those bullets really get to the heart of the information that you think you're missing from this current discussion paper? I'm just trying to discern, what's additional or value add in terms of asking for more information and what might just be repetitive.
Mm-hmm. To the chair, thanks for the question. I might be a little out of my depth in answering that specifically. I think the first couple of bullets really get to looking at, if we could look at bycatch rates, rates of stablefish encounters compared to target encounters in season, and if that gives some indication of when it would be appropriate to consider time and area closures, and then looking more closely at the spatial distribution of incidental catch throughout the season. I think a lot of that is in the discussion paper, so I don't know how much really needs to be further expanded here before you move to analyzing impacts. But I think those first couple that really look at rates and spatial distribution would be helpful. And I also agree that some of the additional data on the composition of incidental catch could be helpful if that data is available. I think there's been some confusion about that particular point. And I think what it was trying to get at was just if there is available information that tells us a little bit more about the composition of the stablefish encountered, during the time that overages are accruing, if that could help inform rates or appropriate time and area closures to consider, that would be helpful as well.
Thank you. Just a quick follow-up, Mr. Chair. So the focus, it seems, for the additional information is to support time and area closures, or either regulatorily or through the co-op management. Did I understand that correctly?
Through the chair, yes, that's correct. That's what I'm saying. Not to say that I would oppose exploring other mechanisms, but to me that seems to make most straightforward.
Thank you.
Any further questions from Ms. Heimbach? Thank you for your testimony. Teresa Peterson.
Hi, good afternoon, Chairman Kineen, council members. Teresa Peterson with the Alaska Marine Conservation Council. Thanks for the opportunity to comment in. I thought that the discussion paper has a lot of information to inform next steps, and Table 3 clearly demonstrates the magnitude of the problem and illustrates the need for management action. We support the AP motion, which does a good job of outlining some of the next steps, along with the testimony the council's been hearing today. The discussion paper also does a good job of outlining the variables which must be considered moving forward to address this issue, such as existing hard caps for salmon and halibut, incentive plans, and for the Amendment 80 fleet, a variety of target species in different fishing operations. It is clear that there are a number of variables to be considered, and we would expect this. As the Council considers recommendations to move this action forward, which AMCC supports along with all the comment letters that the Council received on this agenda item, it's important to look at this in a holistic way in the scope of current management structures and overages occurring in other trawl fisheries, such as Pacific cod. AMCC recommends expanding the discussion to include overages in the AFA-CP sector's allocation for BSAI Pacific cod as well. Although we would agree with previous testifiers that the focus should remain on sablefish if the Council doesn't believe it would be worthwhile to look at these both together. As the North Pacific Council strives to manage our fisheries in a changing climate, a holistic approach which brings forward accountability measures to address overages in both sablefish and peacock, along with the current management of the trawl sector, is warranted. Accountability measures under consideration are consistent with MSA language and intended to prevent a sector annual catch limit from being exceeded. As noted in MSA, AM should address and minimize both the frequency and the magnitude of overages, correct the problems that cause the overage in as short a time as possible. The paper does a good job of highlighting the seasonal differences with the sablefish overages, and it will be important to focus in on bee season, as this is where most of the overages are occurring. The efficacy of MRA should be explored, along with in-season time and area closures, the potential to minimize the overages through intercooperative agreements, and incentive programs in the BSAI and consideration of the target species in relation to the sablefish bycatch. We did note in the paper that there are not examples for other council regions to help address this issue, which makes sense because this is currently a North Pacific issue, but other regions are interested in how this is addressed. To protect the spawning biomass, it will be important to analyze stock composition of the sablefish that are landed, in addition to observer data on the discard. As noted in the discussion paper on page 5, spawning fish and juvenile fish are found in all management areas, but there are not sufficient data to understand if the Alaska sablefish population is dependent on one or more productive spawning locations or juvenile habitats to sustain the population. Without this information, Gothel et al. Suggests it's important to protect spawning biomass in all management areas and maintain fishing mortality on immature fish at reasonable levels. Clearly, this is an important management issue for the Council to address, and AMCC encourages the Council to move this discussion forward and support development of a comprehensive approach to address significant overages in the trawl sector, and most certainly sablefish and consideration of peacock. And thank you. That's all I have today.
Thank you, Ms. Peterson. Are there any questions? Right. Thank you for your testimony. Next up is Alexander Stubbs, then Alexis Kwachka, and the last up will be Arnie Pugelbach.
Can you guys hear me?
We can. Good afternoon.
Okay. Good afternoon, dear council members. I'm a fisherman and quota shareholder of Bering Sea Sablefish in the IFQ program, and I also design and manufacture cod quail slinky pots for a fixed-gear fleet in the Gulf of Alaska and BSAI. I'm also a research biologist. To me, the most concerning part of the trawl sablefish overages is the fact they're concentrated in largely one area. Somewhat mysteriously, the presentation and discussion paper state that, quote, sablefish are not bound by either time or space with the remarkable recruitment of recent year classes and appear to be ubiquitous in the BS and GOA fishing grounds. And then they cite Table 6, Figure 7, and Figure 8. Yet the figures cited in the discussion paper showed just the opposite. Sablefish removals by the trawl fleet are highly concentrated, and the vast majority come from the area around the Horseshoe and ADFG statistical areas 655,430 and 655,409. This is even more apparent from the figures provided by Seascape via public testimony. We just heard from Mr. Haflinger that the vast majority of the sablefish bycatch was in this area, and that basically it was more convenient for them to fish in that area due to fuel and operational costs. When asked by council members what the trawl fishery actually did to avoid sablefish other than sending emails, Mr. Haflinger's response was basically that they didn't do anything and just kept fishing the Horseshoe area and discarding more sablefish. To me, rather than defending the trawl industry, Mr. Haflinger's testimony in particular, his attached figure 5, shows quite clearly that the pollock trawl industry only really encounter large numbers of sablefish in 2 statistical areas. They just don't want to fish farther from port due to operational expenses. Quite frankly, as a biologist, I'm extremely disappointed with the discussion paper's treatment of this issue. I don't believe that the text in the report actually matches the data. One quote from the discussion paper is, quote, "It may therefore not be possible to identify locations or times when targeted closures could affect the overall rates of sablefish catch and trawl fisheries," unquote. To me, it seems like the trawl industry's data and figure 8 from the discussion paper shows very clearly exactly what geographic area that overages come from. Quite frankly, to have a discussion paper with text that so clearly does not match the available data and figures in the same paper is concerning. To me, based on testimony from Seascape and the figures in the discussion paper, it sure sounds like time and area closures would be highly effective in managing this problem. The bottom line is that sablefish overages happen because the pollock fleet likes to fish close to port in the Horseshoe area. The justification for not doing anything is basically that the pollock fishery will endanger other PSC species if they avoid sablefish in this area. If the pollock fishery can't be prosecuted late in the season without apparently endangering other fish stocks, perhaps the council should look seriously at lowering the pollock tack as an accountability measure. Thanks very much.
Thank you for your testimony, Mr. Stubbs. Any questions? All right. I don't see any. Thanks for your time. Next up is Alexis Kwachka.
Mr. Chairman, members of the council, my name is Alexis Kwachka, and I think that I'm going to be very brief. Most of what I wanted to say has already been said here on the last 3 testifiers. I support the AP's motion, and I really think it's important to have an expanded discussion paper to flesh out the pros and the cons and what's going on. And I get frustrated under fully rationalized fisheries, 100% observer coverage, that we continue to see these overages, and this process is really slow. And as a fisherman, we've been waiting for a long time for these recruitment events to occur, and here it's occurring. And I don't care how you justify it; all these fish matter. And now we have basically one rationalized fishery competing against another, and I get frustrated with the inability to change on a quicker note, and appreciate the groups that are changing. I think that's about it. I agree with the previous testifier. I think if we're leaving pollock tack in the water, that we really need to spend some time thinking about that and make sure we're not just draining water and interacting with other bycatch species. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Kwachka. Dr. Balsiger has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Kwachka. I appreciated that. A couple of testifiers noted that the document contained figures and tables that showed most of the sablefish bycatch came from the Horseshoe area. But you may not be the right person to ask, but I'm wondering, isn't that because that's where all the fishing took place? And maybe that is not a disconnect between the analysts and the document saying this basic sablefish is basically everywhere. So if that was the case, do you have any comments on how we might deal with the fact when the black cod really are distributed pretty widely, and the pollock fishery perhaps is better off being executed as quick as it can close to shore. I guess it's kind of a softball question, but I'm still struggling to figure out what else we can do. I agree with what Ms. Kimball said earlier, that it's not an overfishing problem, but it's not a demonstration of good fishery management when 10 million pounds of fish is thrown away. So just your comment on that thought.
Sure, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Balsinger. I think this is a can of worms and a little bit off, and I'm spending less and less time in the Bering Sea. I think that a lot of the problems that we've had have really been based around sea lion mitigation. And, I think if we were really to look at these fisheries and the harvest rates and the pre and post sea lion mitigation and look at some of the strategies around that and what the benefits are and where they are. And I know that this is like off topic and not, but I think that, prosecuting these fisheries, there's only so fast that the fish can be processed in the Bering Sea. And obviously, keeping your costs down by fishing closer to town is more beneficial to everybody, including the quality of the fish. So I think that it's time to start really looking at if we've identified the biological take, and that's what it is, and then we're spending, a ton of money in this process trying to mitigate the fact that we're spreading it out to affect or not affect sea lions. I think it's something that needs to be thought about a little bit into the future. And that's kind of evading your question, but talking about where I think there is a problem.
Okay, thank you. I deserve that for such an open-ended question, but I appreciate your comments. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Dr. Balsinger. Further questions for Mr. Quashket? Okay, thanks for your testimony. Last up is Arnie Fugelbach.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me?
I can. Good afternoon.
Great. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the council. For the record, my name is Arnie Fugelbach, and I'm testifying on behalf of North Star Fishing Company, which has 4 Amendment 80 catcher processors that primarily fish flatfish in the Bering Sea. Sablefish trawl overages have occurred for roughly the past 4 years due to several factors, including unprecedented recruitment, with 3 above-year average classes, 2014, 16, 17, and potentially a 4th, the 2019 year class. While extremely high abundance and westward distribution of several large year classes is obviously a major factor in trawl overages, I believe the effects of freezing the area-wide ABC apportionment is less understood. In 2020, Sablefish stock assessment authors recognized this when they wrote, "The lack of a dynamic connection to shifting resource distribution is a contributing factor to recent ABC overages." As a reminder, in 2013, Sablefish apportionment was frozen until a method could be thoroughly evaluated and reviewed. Continuing the fixed area-wide apportionment for the next 7 years, while these unprecedentedly large year classes were recruiting to the fisheries, has led to a significant multi-year lag between survey distribution and adopted ABCs and TACs. In 2020, the assessment authors recommended moving to a non-exponential 5-year survey apportionment method. While it is certainly an improvement over a fixed method, non-exponential means that all the years are weighted equally instead of the previously adopted method by the council, but weighted the most recent year more heavily. Non-exponential is more stable than exponential, but it may not track biomass distributions well, as the assessment authors noted in an analysis of the various apportion methods they looked at. In December, the SSC recommended a 25% stair step from the current fixed apportionment to the new method. While this is progress, it means that under this apportionment method and these stair steps, it will be 3 more years before the ABC finally catches up with survey distribution. Mr. Chairman, in closing, I believe the council should take no further action on this agenda item. The SSC recommended that further development of apportionment methods should be evaluated that adhere to the goals of avoiding biological concerns by generally following survey estimates. Until we resolve the apportionment issue and area-wide ABC apportionment more closely follows the survey distribution, I believe that any further action is premature at best. If the council does move forward with an expanded discussion paper, then I would request a similar analysis to what John Gruber suggested on the effects of the fixed apportionment method on the ABC in each regulatory area, and whether a trawl overage would have occurred if we were either using the previous council-accepted apportionment method or the one adopted in 2021. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be happy to take questions.
Thank you, Mr. Kugelbach. Any questions? Okay, I don't see any. Okay, thanks again. Okay, Council, that concludes public comment. Let's stand down for about 5 minutes or so and come back and see what action the council would like to take. Back just after 1:28 Alaska time. Okay, Council, please come back to order. And we've heard public comment on D2 and open the floor to the Council on any action they'd like to take. Mr. Jensen.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a motion, and staff will put it up. I'll read it. Thank you. My motion is, Mr. Chair, that Council takes no further action at this time on this issue. With a second, I'll explain my reasoning.
Second, Craig Cross.
Second by Mr. Cross. Mr. Jensen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Cross. My rationale is I can't see where this may lead with further analysis. If in the future the problem persists or increases or changes, then further analysis should be considered and analyzed. While some uncertainties exist regarding sablefish population dynamics, the discussion paper states several times that a conservation concern for the Alaska-wide sablefish stock does not exist. The stock is not overfished, nor is overfishing occurring. The annual catch limit, which is set at the stock level, and total catch are significantly below biomass estimates from the annual stock assessments. This disclaimer makes it clear that recent overages in trawl fisheries sablefish allocations are not a result in any change to fishing patterns or behavior, but are instead coincident with the large increase in numbers of immature sablefish entering into the population 2014, 16, and 17 year classes. And with that, Mr. Chair, I'll try to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jensen. Any questions on the motion? Okay, any amendments? Comments on the motion? Dr. Balsiger.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I mentioned earlier, I agree with the analysis that's been done. I think that the regulations that are set forward and the ways we council have decided to deal with issues like this is being followed. So there's no mistake there. But I also think the council should recognize that a system that allows that much fish to be thrown away by regulation, doesn't allow it, it must be thrown away by regulation, deserves a little greater introspection, I believe. This council is famous for being the blueprint by which the Magnuson Act was reauthorized, perhaps initially put together, and it wasn't because we weren't using the fish that we were catching. I think that the paper did look at all of the commonly accepted fixes, and none of them worked. It didn't look at things like, well, maybe it's time to let the trawlers keep disabled fish. It didn't look at it as one bookend. The other bookend, I guess, is, well, when you get that, you need to stop fishing. So we didn't really explore all possible options. So I'm going to support the motion, but I think the council needs to spend some time thinking, is this the way we really want to manage these fisheries? When you have an extraordinary year class following a failed year class in a different species just a couple of years ago, isn't there some way we can prepare ourselves to deal with those better in the future? And if I had an idea, I'd tell you what it is, but I don't. But I think the council and its collective bodies are some of the smartest fish management people in the world, and we should be able to think of something. And so that's my comment. And as I said, I will support it. And thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Dr. Balsinger. Mr. Twite.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'm glad I'm following Dr. Balsiger because he said several of the things that are on my mind much better than I could. But I do think that this council needs to begin to grapple with the level of discards. With there's a world out there that's hungry for this kind of seafood, and so I would certainly support at some point in the future, in the near future, I would hope, beginning to tackle some of the tools that we use. I understand the frustration of a fair number of stakeholders, and again, I think that ever eloquent Ms. Heimbach probably put it as well as anybody, that she doesn't get why sometimes it might be okay to not implement the guardrails that we have in place that are, so we all acknowledge regularly, are so important to making our system work as well as it does. And I've found that frustrating about this too. And as I think the discussion paper helped me understand that a little bit, but again, maybe probably borrowing and not saying it as well as Dr. Balsiger did, but we could have actually asked the analysts to look a little wider. And what I would have delved into are, from a science standpoint, some of the issues that Mr. Fugelblog brought up in his testimony about the impact on how we set TAC and whether we set ourselves up in a situation where, just from a science standpoint, whether the TAC was going to then establish, the ABC and the TAC were then going to establish allowable bycatch levels that we knew were too low, or whether we chose for other reasons to put ourselves in that situation for policy reasons. Mr. Marks reminded us that at least last year, part of our choice in tax setting was overtly economic in relation to markets. And we should have at that time maybe thought a little bit more about that we were setting up exactly this situation as well. So while I agree with Maker in the motion that it's warranted, I think this has plucked the strings of a couple of larger issues that I'm going to be continuing to think about. But I guess I just want to finally conclude by going on record as saying that, at least from my perspective, the bones of our management framework are still very solid and very sound, and those who are sort of intimating otherwise, I would definitely disagree with. But this is an issue that has exposed some areas where I think we can and should be making improvements, both in terms of the tools that require discarding, but also when we're dealing with sudden increase in a sudden and very welcome increase in a large age class. It's clear that our system doesn't handle that well at this point, and we can put some more thought into that also. Thank Mr. Johnson for his motion.
Thank you, Mr. Clay. Ms. Campbell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was very hopeful, although, I had high hopes, but not a high expectation that this discussion paper would show us that there is a tool available to us within our management system, time and area closure, something like that would make sense to help us address this problem. But our staff put their best effort into letting us know what the data shows, and the data shows us that there really isn't something that's obvious and available to us that's going to help us address the situation. And I think I would like to be able to address it, but I also think that we need to recognize as a council that we set tax low for stable fish, we set ABC well below max ABC, and to some extent we've created an artificial shortage by the way that we do apportionment that is creating these overages, or at least contributing to them. And so some of the decisions that we've made about freezing apportionments or setting tax may be contributing to these overages. And some of those choices were made to provide stability to the directed hook and line fishery, and that's not a bad thing, but it has to be recognized as a contributing factor. Some of the most compelling testimony I heard today was from Mr. Kwachka, who
reminded us that the struggles that we have with Chinook bycatch late in the year, sablefish bycatch in the bee season are a result of trying to push directed fishery catch around to protect stellar sea lions, all of which is based on a totally unproven and theory about localized depletion. And so, in my opinion, if the agency believes that we should be going further and thinking more creatively, perhaps it's time to think more creatively about whether these stellar sea lion regulations are causing more harm than good. I think that might be useful, but I'm not prepared to initiate anything on that today. It obviously would be a long and complex process. So I will say to the folks in the public who brought up the cod issue, I do see that as a distinct issue. It's an issue that I'm concerned about, but it is really different than the sablefish issue, and so I don't think it's appropriate to address the cod issue under this agenda item, but might be something that the council feels is worth looking at in the future. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Campbell. Mr. Mesereau.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I guess my sentiments very similar to Ms. Campbell's and others that spoke before her. This is a difficult issue. Wasting those fish is inexcusable, but we don't have a mechanism to deal with it at the moment. And if one council member, if I was given the choice of whether we want to save Chinook over sablefish at the current levels of abundance, I think that the council's policy at this point, and my feelings personally, is we need to do everything we can to get as many Chinook salmon back into Western Alaska streams for Alaskan tribes and subsistence users, and that is a higher biological priority if we have to choose. And the notion that we should close one area and force the fleet into another area where they'll have higher Chinook encounter rates is an unacceptable trade-off with the tools that we have. And I think we should take a look at some of these other broader issues, maybe after we resolve some of these ones that are in front of us today, to try to figure out a better way to do this. But for right now, we don't have the tools in front of us, and unfortunately, we're not going to be able to do much about this at the moment. So I support Mr. Jensen's motion, and I appreciate it coming from him, who resides in Petersburg, where there's a large number of fixed-gear fishermen that depend on sablefish. It's a difficult thing to do that, and so I appreciate him making the motion. And unfortunately, this is one that I'll support but not be happy about the outcome. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Mesereau. Ms. Kimball.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Jensen, for the motion. I guess I feel like most of my fellow council members, I was trying to get at whether the AP had, something additional in their motion. And I really do appreciate the work that the AP put into their motion. I think I found some confusing components of it. I was trying to figure out if there was some additional value from any of these bullets. I really think they did a lot of work to try to get there, but I think when it came down to it, some of the testimony about, getting us to an outcome about a management tool that I think we have a pretty complete paper just says isn't going to get us where we want to go. That convinced me that maybe going down another road with this extended discussion paper wasn't maybe the right thing or great use of our time. And instead we need to think maybe more holistically than we have been. I just think it's important. All council members seem to be concerned about this. It's great that everyone is speaking to it directly. I think there are some real trade-offs with PFC. That's a real issue. I agree with council members that indicate we have a paper here and an SSC report previously that indicates this isn't a conservation concern, but it's certainly a management issue while we're encountering 3 record-setting year classes of sablefish. And I recognize we haven't yet set area apportionment consistent with the survey to reflect the distribution of sablefish. I recognize we've set very conservative tax for a reason largely economic and trying to provide some more stability to the fixed gear sector. But it still doesn't really get us out of this management box. I also wanted to just address briefly, I think, fishing close to shore, fishing where the fish are, is not just for operating costs. I think it's important we recognize fish quality is important. Delivering into the communities in the Alaska Peninsula and Aleutian Chain are important. And especially not extending into areas with higher Chinook bycatch is important. I think making sure we get our target fish out of the water quickly to avoid a longer time on the water, avoid future interactions with other important species, is a really important consideration. And I think last, Mr. Chair, I just wanted to say we did hear some testimony, some confusion with the disconnect between, sablefish overages and the trawl fleets, and then the estimates for the fixed gear sablefish regarding a different action in terms of our fixed gear sablefish discard action. How can one be moderate or negligible and one be a problem? And I think some of those concerns are valid. I don't think that this is the agenda item in which to address them. I anticipate we'll hear more about that in staff tasking, but I just wanted to recognize that testimony was compelling to me as well. Thanks. I'll support the motion.
Thank you, Ms. Kimball. Mr. Downs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Jensen, for your motion. I find myself torn on this a bit. I'm going to support the motion just because I don't think we have before us a clear path, nor do we have perhaps everything that we would need to move forward to look at some of these regulatory impediments. I really appreciate the comments that have been made here. I've been listening carefully. I appreciated Mr. Balsinger's comments that perhaps we need to find some way that we're not living under regulations that require people to dump fish over the side. That's something that we've considered for a long time that bothers a lot of people about our current management style. Ms. Campbell's comments on the Stellar Sea Lion regulations really resonate, I think, as well. Mr. Twite had some great comments on a few things that should be looked at, as well as kind of, I think to use the term that one of the testifiers used, I think we are hamstrung by regulatory impediments here. I think that's part of the issue. And when I look at the AP motion, and Ms. Kimball, you spoke to that, very well, but I look at the AP motion, I'm looking at, accountability measures and providing the data when incidental rates increase, and incentives for inter-co-op agreements, incentive plans, accountability measures that could be applied to sector-specific levels. So much of that, when I read that, I really think that this is beholden, and it's an obligation, I think, that the industry has to under these current circumstances, if you're going to have a fishery, regardless of where the current ABC and TAC are for this species, that there's an obligation to try to do everything you can to not end up at 500%, even though we realize that 500% over your allocation, or where cod is concerned. I appreciate Ms. Campbell's comments on this, that cod probably is a separate issue, but it does have a nexus here. And so, I'm going to support this motion. I think when we take a vote on this motion, Mr. Chairman, I would like to speak more to have an open discussion among the council about what we would expect or not expect for industry to be looking at, and the kinds of things we'd like to see them report to us. Because I have a feeling that just by taking no action, there's some people that are going to be upset about this. We have to, in my opinion, we can't take no action and then not ask industry to step up their reporting and their what the AP referred to as their accountability measures here. So I'd like to speak to that after we take a vote on this motion. I'll support the motion. Thank you.
Mr. Marks.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Mr. Jensen, for the motion and for the original motion. I think there's some good information that's come out through the staff report. I thought there was some really good information that also came out through public testimony and folks that are engaged in the fishery and other thoughts outside the box and that, you know, and as I also very much appreciate the council discussion and some out of the box thinking and I support the motion, but I think there's a number of items in here that are worth keeping in mind as we go forward and how do we better apply those in our annual course of business and look for these red flags as they come up and maybe we'll have a better solution at the time and I think folks have learned a lot as far as avoidance where things happen, and if we can overcome some of these hurdles, I think it's just a good opportunity to actually avoid excess, and if we do, how do we better utilize it? So again, thanks, Mr. Jensen, and I'll support the motion.
Thank you, Mr. Marks. Any further comments on the motion? All right. Go ahead and move to a vote. Is there any opposition? No opposition. The motion passes unanimously. Further action or get further action on this agenda item. Mr. Down.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't know if any other council members will want to speak to this, but you know, being that we've just taken no action on this and that this is still a legitimate issue, I think, in the minds of many of the stakeholders that want to protect this long-awaited for spawning biomass and these recruitments that we've had. We've had some good reports. I thought the Amendment 80 report on the things that they were doing was quite good, but we've also heard reports that were, you know, really, you know, they don't know what to do. A report that we're doing just kind of a trust us, we're doing everything we can report, and I would like to encourage industry representatives that have bycatch of sablefish to come to us. It wasn't that we were given no tool in this action. Yeah, the document clearly identified a tool that we do have. The tool that we do have is to reduce the pollock tack. That's one, or to look at the tack of other species where there's sablefish bycatch. That's a tool that we do have. We look at that every year. And when I was looking at the pollock tack in 2020, I found that on the 9th of May, the pollock fishery exceeded their sector allocation for cod. And so they had 695,000 tons of pollock remaining. So if we intended to set the tack at a level that would if we're interested in setting the pollock tack at a level that would keep the pollock industry within their cod allocation, they would have left 695,000 metric tons of pollock on the table, and nobody wants to go there. And I'm not suggesting that we do. That would be way too extreme. And you know, the pollock industry is the thing that I think supports all fisheries. You know, and when I say that, I mean that in the pollock fishery, you know, the big cold storages and the big trampers that are out there hauling our freight and giving us good freight rates, but they're not there for the pot fleet. You know, these guys are there because of the pollock industry. That's what supports all. But I think that when we look at that kind of thing, on July 4th in 2020, the pollock fishery exceeded their sablefish allocation, and they still had 598,000 metric tons of pollock left to go, and they were already over their sablefish allocation. So I think when we look at the tack, if the pollock industry is interested in continuing this average 1.3 million tons of pollock from the 2 million metric ton cap, I think it's beholden on them. I think it's obligation that they have to come to the council before we set that cap and say, here's our plan for avoiding. And then we can look at how those plans worked out. If their plan is we're not going to be able to do anything, we just expect that we're going to be 300 or 500% over our sablefish allocation because of these circumstances, and that's what they would report to us. And then we would at least know in advance that we are expecting this, that that's a likely outcome of setting the pollock tax at these levels. So I appreciate the time, Mr. Chairman, that you've given me on this. I think it's incredibly important that this was mentioned and that other council members are given a chance to speak to these issues that I brought up, because taking no action is not going to sit well with some people. And I want to let them know, at least in my mind, that I would like to see some action from industry on their reaction to our taking no action on this decision.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Down. If open to thoughts from other council members on a reaction to that. I don't necessarily take your comments there as a potential action for the council, and I don't think you necessarily intended it. You were just signaling some thoughts. But certainly you could be a little more prescriptive if you would like. But happy to hear from other council members their reactions. Okay. Ms. Kimball?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to ensure that communication was clear. Mr. Downs, are you asking for a specific report from each sector to come back to us? I think in terms of agency requirements for, PRA and things like that, we should just be clear if we're asking for a report back, so we know the path forward. But maybe I misunderstood.
Yes, thank you very much, Ms. Kimball, for that. I wasn't clear on that because I haven't heard the will of the rest of the council. This is just me speaking as one member of the council. That I think it would be wise for the council to send a signal to industry that we expect if they're supporting a pollock tax, that they also have some estimate or some mitigation measures in place for how they plan to prosecute that fishery at these levels that generally exceed 1 million metric tons. That we know what that means when it comes to sablefish. So I don't have anything clearer than that, Ms. Kimball. I suppose we can wait to see in October and December if industry, if this resonates with industry, if they report anything back. But I think they've got a lot at stake here, so I'm hoping that they do. But if it's not the will of the council, if other council members don't desire for them to report back, then they can voice their opinions as well. So this is just the opinion of one council member this time, and I am not making this as a motion or a council directive. Thank you.
Thank you. Through the chair, that answers my question, Mr. Down. Thank you. I might have misunderstood initially, but I understand now. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Kimball. Other council members? Dr. Bolster, that's an old hand raise, correct? Oh, okay, Ms. Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and sorry for the delay. I was just kind of absorbing the exchange between Ms. Kimball and Mr. Down, and so while I understand Mr. Down's request and certainly hear his perspective in terms of it would be useful perhaps to hear about industry plans. My question in terms of your expectations, Mr. Down, you mentioned specifically particularly helpful testimony today that we received in terms of information provided to the council to help you understand perhaps measures that industry was taking with regard to sablefish bycatch. Is something like that a type of report that you would consider useful with the comments that you were making? Trying to put some bounds around what your expectations may be.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Baker. The report, I think the reports that we heard were helpful, but the difference in, of course, what we heard today and what I'm asking for is those reports were after the fact. Here's what we did, or here's what we weren't able to do anything with one report, and didn't have the tools because of. And I understand that. I understand that. I agree with Mr. Mesereau that Chinook is the primary species we're concerned. Let's get some Chinook salmon back in these western Alaska rivers, and we can use some Chinook down here in Washington State as well. So I understand that, but I'm saying that before we set a TAC, I think industry should report how they expect to prosecute that level of pollock TAC, for instance, and the things that they're going to do to avoid in their expectations of where they might end up the season. I don't think it was a big surprise that they ran into a lot of pollock. We had one segment in Amendment 80 that was able to maintain their levels pretty well, and we had one sector in pollock, CP particularly, that went way over. So, thanks. And the difference is, to answer your question directly, the difference would be that what I'm suggesting is a report before we set final TAC in December.
Thank you, Mr. Down. I appreciate that answer.
Mr. Mesereau.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess in response to Mr. Down's comments, I would not object to getting a report in the fall. I'm not supportive of using the tax setting process as a punitive measure, but I think we already did that accidentally by keeping the ABC low on sablefish, which ended up making the trawl sector make their overages look far worse than they would have been. I don't know the exact balancing point for that, but I'm afraid that through our own best intentions, we've made this problem worse than it is. And I think I would like to hear how they plan to avoid sablefish in the fall. I think it's a reasonable request. I don't think it's outrageous, but I think indicating or making a threat that we're going to up the pollock TAC if they don't, I hesitate to do anything like that. I think that making threats and then not following through is really bad policy. So I don't think that my opinion that this council would be supportive of somehow impeding optimum yield as a penalty for bad behavior, but I also think it would be good to know what's happening and keep us apprised so that we're prepared to see if we need to discuss other broader issues like the ones that Ms. Campbell and Ms. Kimball brought up in public testimony. So I think it's good to know, and I think it has to be voluntary, and if they would be willing to come before us and provide us with that information, it would be helpful to have that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Nezero, and I think following up on some of your comments there towards the end regarding this being voluntary or not, it's going to be helpful to have Ms. Smoker perhaps like she's seeking recognition, and perhaps she can remind us a little bit about our ability to make these requests versus, we've just lose it. Okay, we'll stand by for just a minute, Ms. Smoker. Like you're getting a call back. Is your system muted, Ms. Smoker? Maybe a *6 somewhere.
Okay. Does that work now? I'm sorry. Thank you. Thank you. I hit the hang up button instead of the unmute. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, I appreciate the conversation and wanted to seek recognition because when the council has been interested in the past in getting even voluntary reports, there's been a request that the council kind of make a motion to that effect and be able to provide the public with the information that they're looking for in these voluntary reports. And then the agency needs to file Paperwork Reduction Act that needs to follow those processes even for voluntary reports. So my advice to the council is if the council is interested in seeking this information, that's fine. But I think a motion that is clear, that outlines the information you're seeking from the public in these voluntary reports will help the public and the agency in complying with the Paperwork Reduction Act requirements. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Walker. That's helpful. Dr. Balsiger.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I didn't want Mr. Downs' statement or plea or request by not answering anything to think that I didn't agree with it. As I said earlier, I think that this council and there's no guilty parties here. I don't think that the pollock fishery is interested in killing sablefish. I'm pretty sure they just as soon catch all their pollock without getting that overburden of sablefish, which is regulatorily discarded. And so when I said I think the council as a whole needs to approach this thing, I didn't mean the 11 people sitting at the table or the AP and the SSC. I think everyone has to. And whether we need a motion such as Mr. Downs perhaps going to make to get that way or not, I'm not sure. But I don't think any of the people associated with this outfit for 47 years believes that it's good for us to manage fish where we're throwing away that many fish. And there should be a bigger think tank about that. So, and as I said earlier, I don't have that solution in mind, and perhaps it doesn't exist, but I don't think we should just drop it.
Thank you, Dr. Balsiger. So I wonder if at this point, and I'll look to you, Mr. Down, to see what you would like to do, but I wonder if it would perhaps make sense to consider Ms. Smoker's comments, and if a motion is desired, we could perhaps come back to that at staff tasking after thinking about that a little bit more, whether that's something you're interested in doing it at this meeting or consider for the future. But I'll look to you to see what you'd like to do, Mr. Down.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm fine with that plan. I think that's good. I appreciate Ms. Smoker's words on this and her advice. So I think that if I was to make a motion, I would come back with staff task. I think we've had a good discussion here. This is exactly what I wanted to happen. I think it's important that because we took no action on something that we're very concerned about, that we had a discussion on any kind of mitigation measures or things. So consider that. I may or may not bring a motion at staff tasking, but I'll take that under consideration that if we want to go further with this, that would be the preferred. I agree that that's the preferred protocol to move this forward. If I desire to do that, I'll give you plenty of notice, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Down. Anything further on D2? Okay, let's go ahead and take a break here. Come back let's come back at 2:15, and we'll take up agenda item D3.
Mr. Chairman, I am just making sure people can hear.
All right. Ms. Davis, apologies. I was misconnected somehow. I'll blame it. I'll blame it on the technology. Okay, we are ready to move into agenda item D3, and I will invite Ms. Diana Evans to introduce us to this item and the various parts and presentations we'll be going through today. Ms. Evans.
Good afternoon, members of the council. This is Diana Evans, council staff, and I'm just going to give a short introduction before launching into the first part of the presentation. So you have two reports that you're receiving today under this agenda item. They're both related to the Bering Sea Fishery Ecosystem Plan. The first is our annual team report. We met in May, and we're reporting out to you at this meeting. I will be sharing that report with my co-chair, Dr. Kiram Aden. And we'll walk that through first. And then after that, we'll pass it over to Dr. Diana Stram and Dr. Kirsten Holzman, who are co-chairs of the Climate Change Task Force, the action module of the FEP that is looking specifically at climate change, adaptation impacts, etc. So to start off, we will walk through this first presentation, and I'll get us going here right quick. So our team met for our annual meeting in May 2021, and we have the tasks, the terms of reference laid out in the FEP and formalized in the terms of reference to do 4 tasks, and you can see them in the gray bullets on this slide, what our team's job is. We've organized the report and the agenda for our meeting loosely around those tasks. And this is the order in which we're going to go through and explain things to you. And I'll be doing the first couple of these and then pass over to Dr. Aden for the remainder. So our first task that we looked at on our team agenda was in response to a council motion in February 2021 when you were receiving presentations from the Climate Change Task Force and also from the FEP team. And we noted that we had talked to you about developing a Bering Sea Ecosystem Health Report. And one of your requests at that February meeting was to spend some time putting a little bit more clarity together regarding the existing and the proposed new products through the FEP that all seem to be a little bit dealing with similar subjects or overlapping subjects. And you asked for some additional clarity about how to describe those different products. And so what we did as a team is to work on this graphic, which you see displayed here. It's also in our report, trying to identify how the existing products that you're used to would interplay with the proposed products that we have been talking about through the Fishery Ecosystem Plan. So if you look in the center of this graphic, the blue and the teal colors, those really represent documents, reports that you are used to seeing. On the left-hand side, at an LME-based level, so for the Gulf of Alaska, for the Bering Sea, for the Aleutian Islands, you receive an ecosystem status report, and there is also an in-brief version of that, a 4-page summary of the ecosystem status report. And that is information that you get looking at ecosystem indicators, specifically focused on the task of looking to set annual harvest specifications. So in the past, the ecosystem status report this council started receiving those in the mid-90s. There used to be a time when we used that ecosystem considerations report, as it was told then, to kind of park all of the information we had about the ecosystem. But over time, that's really developed into something that's a lot more specific and really focused on that harvest specifications information that you need in order to do a good job with your tactical job of setting harvest specifications. In the teal, you can see a stock-based information, and that is really focusing on those ecosystem and socioeconomic profiles. I know you've had presentations about those, but those are pulling those ecosystem information at the level of the stock. So what do you need to better understand the assessment, the information that goes into providing that? And those information from those two reports, the ecosystem status report and the EFP, both are used together to fill in a column of the risk table for each stock assessment that then is part of your SAFE report. Again, all of those documents are really focused on the technical task of setting annual harvest specifications. You can see at the very bottom of the graphic, there are other council management actions where you use ecosystem information, and that information can be pulled from the ESPs, it can be pulled from the ESRs, it can also be pulled from the fishery ecosystem plans. The other council management actions that you do still pull on that same information, but the documents themselves are specifically geared towards allowing you to do the best job that you can with setting harbor specifications. On the right-hand side of the graphic is the information that is available to you, and we are proposing to increase the amount of information available to you that looks at things from a strategic perspective. So again, the FEP is really focusing on that strategic look at, are we meeting our ecosystem goals? Are we doing the ecosystem-based fishery management in the best way that we can identify that works for this council and for the Alaska fisheries? So back in 2014, in the top red, you can see we have an ecosystem vision statement that was adopted by the council. That's a really high-level one-page statement. We have fishery ecosystem plans, originally for the Aleutian Islands and now also for the Bering Sea, where we're spending most of our attention at the moment. That FEP breaks down kind of big picture ecosystem goals in the vision statement into very specific ecosystem objectives, not very specific, but more specific ecosystem objectives for the Bering Sea. And what we're proposing through this Bering Sea Ecosystem Health Report, which would be the next box down and dotted line indicating that it's under development, is to provide you a way of tracking how is the council meeting those goals and objectives for the Bering Sea. So at a strategic level, rather than the very specific tactical information that is specifically to inform harvest specifications, this is taking a step back and looking strategically at your ecosystem information. And then also we have, through the climate module, doing more work to look specifically at the impacts of climate change. And I'm not going to go into detail about that report because you're going to get that in the next presentation, but just recognizing that's also one of those strategic looks at how you can consider your management program from a strategic perspective. So hopefully this graphic helps to separate out the difference between those various reports. The next slide here just has the words specific to that I just walked through out loud. Our intention is to take these two slides and put them into a one-page, a single-page graphic that we can then post on our website and make available to be more clear about the different products that we're talking about. And then we also have this other slide that is looking specifically at those three types of reports: the ecosystem status report, the ESP, the ecosystem and socioeconomic profile, that is stock-specific, and the Bering Sea Ecosystem Health Report, a strategic look at whether the council is achieving their goals, and just try to compare the difference between those types of products so that you can see how they are different from each other and how they will serve different purposes in this process. The second part of our meeting was to look at the action modules and to better understand ongoing progress with the two action modules that the council has initiated on local knowledge, traditional knowledge, and subsistence information, and then on climate change. We haven't summarized any of that information in this presentation. You received a briefing on the progress of the LKTKS task force in February, and the climate change task force you're going to be getting this meeting. So we're not going to duplicate information that you're getting from them, but just noting that the team supports the ongoing work of both of those task forces. I think they're really just beginning to get into the process of making progress on those work plans, and we're really excited to see what comes out of that work. We intend to liaise with both task forces as we develop the Bering Sea Ecosystem Health Report, and in general, we had a good conversation with both the task force chairs just to find ways to improve our ongoing communication and coordination between the team and the task forces into the future. With that, I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Aiden, who's going to talk in a little bit more specifically about the Ecosystem Health Report and the progress we made with that design and development.
Thank you, Diana, and members of the council. I briefly talk about the Ecosystem Health Report, that a project that was initiated when the base FEP was approved and is continuing now. We've had a sort of substantial COVID pause in this work, and we're picking it up this year. The Ecosystem Health Report fits into objectives described in the FEP base document, revolving both monitoring the Bering Sea ecosystem as a FEP team task and developing performance metrics to evaluate ecosystem effect, specific management actions. And this also fits in with our tasking to provide strategic guidance for monitoring the Bering Sea ecosystem status. The purpose of this report is essentially to look at cumulative and multi-species effects, especially in cases where synthesis is needed across multiple species and stocks that may not be looked at when ecosystem considerations are looked at stock by stock, for example, when making tactical management decisions. It goes through a diversity of audiences, and the idea is that it would monitor the success of EBF management actions. And the goal is that this isn't a thorough and long scientific document, but a communicative document that does not overwhelm the audience. So in looking at this, we were picking where this work left off about a year ago. We talked about what these sorts of reports could look like, and these couple of slides show a variety of ways around the world that this information has been presented in the past. And one of the important concepts is that we really are trying to measure success with this, whether that's scored as color coding or a numerical ranking or red light, green light or something. It's really, again, in an action informing, not in an action enforcing way, meant to actually quantify to a certain extent how our management actions and their EBFM actions are specifically functioning and how they're successful. I should say that the one that says Bering Sea Aleutian Islands up here was a multinational project to collect an academic project to collect data from multiple marine ecosystems and compare them. It wasn't a specific Bering Sea effort. But in any case, these are some methods. Here's a couple others taken from different places around the world. This one from Europe, showing a variety of color coding and communication methods for various ecological indicators that we might choose to monitor. Over the next path, our intent is we're seeing this as a year-long project to develop a pilot report. The pilot report would contain recommendations for what to monitor over time for EBFM success, what data or information to use, and also it will recommend how often to monitor, whether we're doing this annually or whether it's on a longer cycle. And it will also recommend things like the report format and what new indicators might be developed. It might include, indicator levels for raising flags for things for the council to pay attention to, and it will also include a pilot report on the current state of the Bering Sea according to these indicators. The pilot report itself will synthesize data and past trends of the ecosystem. It will be an FEP team product. It will not come, for example, from Alaska Fisheries Science Center's ESR team. It's it's similar in a way to what we did back when we did the Aleutian Islands FEP and put a very broad ecosystem overview. Essentially, that was left out of the initial Bering FEP because we wanted that to be a living progress report rather than a part of the core report. And so this is finally realizing that final step of the FEP monitoring, at least in terms of the base report tasks that we set ourselves. The report starting point is that the focus is strategic. So we're looking at what can provide longer-term strategic advice rather than near-term ABC or any other sort of annual management advice. And in order to allow the fisheries management to strategically ensure that it is sufficiently responsive to changes in the ecosystem. As an organizing principle, we felt coming out of this workshop that organizing by the 6 ecosystem goals of the council is probably the best organizing principle. And the FEP, in its base report, developed a set of objectives under that goal. And the May 3rd workshop, we brainstormed a lot of ideas and data sources, and the work over the next year is to realize and review those. I'm going to briefly step through those goals and objectives just as a reminder, and describe briefly again, still in the early discussion stage, some of the thoughts we put to these. The council ecosystem goals are divided into 6 sections. I'm going to read through each of these with individual slides, so I won't read through them here. But so underneath each of these goals, the FEP base document approved a set of 17 objectives, and these are each listed here. And so for ecosystem goal 1, that's to maintain, rebuild, and restore fish stocks at levels sufficient to protect, maintain, and restore food web structure and function. Mainly, and there's 3 objectives under this. Mainly are the indicators we talked about are ones coming from traditional stock assessment, especially, for example, the FSSI, or Fishery Stock Sustainability Index, which has been tracked by the ESR for a number of years now. But we also talked about a range of ADC level reporting and total biomass level reporting to continue to track how our major stocks are doing as a cumulative whole. Ecosystem goal 2, to protect and restore and maintain ecological processes, trophic level, and diversity, with focus on predator-prey relationships and structures and functions in the ecosystem. These are very broad composite indices, such as the trophic level of the catch, the length structure of the population, the age structure of populations combined, multiple populations. These were a similar set of indicators was designed back when the PSEIS, the Programmatic Environmental Impact Statement, work was done. And in a way, that's a refresh of the cumulative effects discussions that were implemented there. Ecosystem goal 3, to conserve habitats for fish and other wildlife, which includes our minimization of impacts to protected species, seabirds and marine mammals. The indices we talked about here, again, building on our experience with the ESRs, were trends in seabirds, trends in bycatch, trends in impact of deer types on, or the footprint of fisheries of different deer types over time. Again, all of these should sound familiar to people who have read the ESRs. The core value added of this particular project is that it pulls them together specifically for a strategic look, in the one place for a strategic look, rather than the tactical year-to-year advice that the ESRs focus on. Ecosystem goal 4, provide for subsistence, commercial, recreational, and non-consumptive uses of the marine environment. This is where we would bring in, we talked about a range of economic and socioeconomic indicators that have been collected over time. And it also talks, this is one of our key interfaces with the LKTK task team and developers of LKTK knowledge. And in saying that, I should be clear that as we're investigating this and bringing LK and TK knowledge into this process, we don't mean to isolate it in one place. We expect it to be informative for many of these goals, but this goal brings it to a special focus for that. Ecosystem goals 5 and 6, irreversible or long-term adverse effects and legacy. The initial FEP objectives did not categorize the 3 objectives under these to goal 5 and 6 separately, but combine them. So they're effectively one larger goal. But here is where we particularly talked about documenting our strategic approach to climate change. And this is an exercise in collaboration along with the Climate Change Task Force And to be clear, you're going to hear about reports that they're recommending and that we're recommending. We will be working closely in concert to make sure that there's no duplicative information and the right types of information are in the right homes, depending on this. So that work is ongoing. Our overall timeline for this work, following this report, this final report to the council today, between now and February, the initial work is to develop a list of data sources, a broad list, really casting the net wide, including both what we have and what we might need and what's collectible, with an initial check-in given the council in October. And we really hope that this is an open process with plenty of opportunity for input back and forth. So we would highlight that that it's really important to get all the data on the table and have a look at that perhaps in October and then moving forward. And in part of this, we are, as recommended in February in both the reports from the SSC, the Ecosystem Committee, and the Council, that we will ensure that we are doing check-ins and report outs to all of the plan teams that are involved in this: groundfish, crab, social sciences, and our existing task forces. The goal is we're planning our FEP team annual meeting for next March to produce a first iteration draft that would then be reviewed by the council as a full draft. In that review process, we would look to start in April. Some very specific feedback that we've been discussing. One, and this is maybe a little fine point, but it's worth pointing out. In developing this report, we have found in talking with a wide range of stakeholders and people in the council bodies that the term health is a very strongly intuitive one that people get immediately the sorts of things that we're talking about. However, it has been very much pointed out that the term health is also very normative and very looking towards a status quo, as if there's a very particular state that we would define as healthy and that our strategic goal is to get back to that. Especially in the face of climate change, that may be a very challenging assumption to work with. So to the extent that we use the term health, we are going to have to very, very carefully define that or move away from that term, and there's certain scientific preferences around that. Other than some comments on that, here we're primarily seeing if there's anything with the process and the approach that should be changed or considered at this early point, and whether we should look forward to a direct check-in in October. My final slide is sort of zooming out a little bit to the remainder of the FEP work outside of the health report, which we expect to be what we are primarily engaged with over the next year as a core FEP team. Remembering that the CCTF, the Climate Change Task Force, we will hear from in a moment, and the LKTK Task Force will continue their own work on their timelines. We examined originally, when this FEP was approved, the council approved 5 action modules, but suggested, given our resources, to move forward on 2, leaving 3 in a kind of a holding pattern. We reviewed those in May and felt that was still appropriate. They remain of interest, but not necessarily right for a full council action model on the subject. But we did note that there's been various progress on each of these, the underlying activities outside of the FEP. We had no specific recommendations this year for new Bering Sea action modules. However, we did discuss, as this was raised back to us at the February council meeting, how this work would in the future expand to other ecosystems. And to be clear, we did not talk about this as if we would be the team. We received a report from Martin Dorn on the science of the GOA ecosystem, and in particular the ongoing projects at AFSC and also cross-region or cross-institution projects going on for Gulf of Alaska Science, and also the planning efforts such as the Climate Regional Action Plan for the Gulf and the GOA-CLIME simulation modeling projects. And we felt that we suggested that the council effort is most right to, it's seen as an overall package rather than to develop new Bering Sea action modules, to look towards the process for the Gulf and other ecosystems. We also had and this is captured in our minutes, a discussion of the pros and cons of whether there's one overarching FEP team, which might be good for long-term ongoing maintenance, versus ecosystem-specific teams, which we felt, at least in the scoping process, given especially the differences in the user communities between the Gulf and the Bering Sea, that a lot of that scoping should be new and fresh, and with people in that process that are more Gulf focused. As our current team membership is still more tilted towards the Bering Sea, of course. So with that, I'd say thank you very much, and that concludes this proportion of our report.
Thank you, Dr. Higgins. If there's any questions before we move on. Okay. All right, thanks again. Move into the Climate Change Task Force overview.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is Diana Stram. Hopefully you can hear me okay.
We can. Good afternoon, Dr. Stram.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the Council. Diana Stram, Council staff. I'm also the co-chair of the Climate Change Task Force with Dr. Kirsten Holzman, and we will be tag-teaming this presentation. I wanted to point out some of the stuff that is posted to your e-agenda. The minutes from our last meeting that we're going to walk through a little bit here are posted to the agenda. I would note, and you heard in your SSD report earlier in this meeting, that we focused only on the action items in our minutes, so we failed to note that we did receive presentations on ACLIME as well as the LKTK Subsistence Task Force updates, but they were not action items, so they weren't included in our minutes at that time. We also have posted separately Figure 6 that we'll be walking through in this presentation, which is a process figure in terms of how we fit into the general process and what we're proposing to do. And then we also have an Excel file that shows you a more detailed, our draft timeline and milestones. We'll talk about some of those during this meeting that we are still working on all of that. The work plan itself that you approved at the last meeting with some requested revisions has been updated and is now posted to the council website as a final work product. I would note that these are on the slide are the members of the Climate Change Task Force, and per council direction at the last meeting, we did add an additional member, Mr. Todd Loomis of Ocean Peace, and so he is an additional fishing representative on the task force and was very helpful at our last meeting. So we appreciate having his inclusion. So just to review for you quickly, that the goal of the climate change module is to facilitate the council's work towards climate-ready fisheries management, and that's to help ensure both the short and the long-term resilience for the Bering Sea. So the meetings that we've had thus far, we had our first startup meeting in January of 2020. We reported back to the council bodies at that time in February. Just after the February 2020 meeting, we had our second meeting, and that was when we began to develop our framework and our proposed process. We put together an initial draft of our work plan, and immediately following that meeting, we provided a verbal update to the FEP team. After that time, things got a little bit slowed down due to COVID, and we were not able to have an additional meeting until just this past December, where we had our third meeting and reported out to the council in February with our draft work plan. And then we've just completed our fourth meeting in May, where we worked on finalizing the work plan based on feedback that we'd heard from council committees as well as the council itself. So our meeting then occurred over 2 days in May. It was sort of a split work session in order for us to get through all of the work that we needed to do in order to finalize this work plan so we can go on to actually conduct the work plan. So the goals of the meeting then were to review our progress since the previous meeting, discuss and address all the comments to the work plan that we'll go through. We revised our process figure. Again, that's the one that is also posted separately to your e-agenda so you can look at it in more detail. And then to identify the timeline and the deliverables. So we accomplished all of that during our meeting. We have a final work plan. We're not intending to continue to revise the work plan. All of our additional revisions will go through some live deliverables documents that will be the work product that will be delivered to the council. We did add a live glossary of terms that are added to the work plan. That was one of the requests that we had received. We heavily revised the overview of it to add plain language. That was some feedback we'd heard from both the Ecosystem Committee as well as the council, to make sure that in addition to describing in detail in the work plan, that we also add language to the work plan that makes it very clear what we intend to do. So we've revised it that way. We've also identified activities for now through September of 2021. Updating of Table 1, that's going to be a live table, and Dr. Holzman will walk through what the intent of that table is. As you heard from the FEP team, we're working with them to help develop some climate indicators, so a short list of climate indicators that would fall under those ecosystem goals. One main thing that we've been requested and we chose to put forward is a synthesis of our current climate readiness. This is something that we want to do right off the bat so that we can ideally come back with this together in the fall. And that would basically be how are we currently situated in our fishery management plan, that is, not necessarily the research component of it, but as a council of fishery management in the Bering Sea, where is their current state of climate readiness? And that will give us a baseline upon which to move forward under our work plan in terms of making recommendations and identifying gaps. And then finally, we will be drafting what will become our climate change report. So we want to start putting together an outline, and that's one of the products that will come out of the Climate Change Task Force for the council. At this point, Mr. Chairman, I will turn it over to my co-chair, and she's going to pick up from here on the slide.
Thanks, Diana, and thank you, members of the council. Hopefully you can hear me okay. I'll go ahead and start here with talking about some of the clarifications that we did. One thing we wanted to highlight was that we had 3 stated objectives for the work plan, which are essentially interrelated steps to get us to our end product. And so what we did is we added a little bit of clarification around this to summarize those 3 objectives as collate, synthesize, and communicate climate change information and knowledge. So the first step in particular, Diana was just talking about the planned product for the fall, which will be a review of the current climate readiness and the amount of climate information that's currently in council products and documents. And that's something we envision will continue to update on a regular basis. We'll present it first in the fall and then again as part of a climate change report, which I'll talk about in a moment. So this first step is about collecting the information, evaluating mechanisms and processes through which that information could be brought to the council process, identify if there are gaps in that information, and help create opportunities to increase the inclusion of a broad set of information and knowledge to the council. The second step is synthesizing. So taking that information, which is pretty vast. There's quite a bit of information on climate change and fisheries that are relevant for the Alaska system and the Bering Sea in particular. And so we need to synthesize that a bit and organize it and think in terms specifically about long-term climate change impacts and scenarios and help create pathways for inclusion of that information into the process. And then finally, the final step is to communicate that, so to deliver that information organized into near-term, long-term, and tactical and strategic kind of characterizations and plug that into existing council processes, and then also summarize some of the information around risk assessments, adaptation, and options for responding to climate-driven change, and summarize that in our climate change report. So through this process, we've used sort of a visual tool to help us understand how we could map into existing processes and products, and then what additional needs we might need to address. And again, the process that we're proposing here is something that we're testing out as the task force. And so part of this is also spending some time at the end of the task force lifespan to think about how this gets picked up and continues going forward. So as much as possible, we're trying to plug into existing processes. And so what we did is you've seen a version of this figure 6. We received a considerable amount of helpful feedback on the figure, and we revised it to clarify exactly what the task force actions and deliverables would be. Those are all highlighted in orange here. And the existing process is sort of highlighted in blue. And so we used the ground fish stock assessment process as a starting place, looking in particular at mechanisms through the existing SAFE reports, and then also tying in and coordinating with the FEP health report that you just heard Diana and Karen present. One of the things we also did is we thought about different on-ramps for information and where those on-ramps might lead, and divided that into 3 categories, which are really not truly separate in reality, but it's helpful for separating them here because it helps us organize from that information. In truth, the management is a combination of tactical, strategic, near-term, and long-term advice. But we wanted to separate that here so we could divvy up these sources of information and map them to those on-ramps and management processes. So we did that in a bit, and I'll show a few slides of examples of what those on-ramps look like. And then the other thing we wanted to highlight is that we intend to meet quarterly as part of the task force and have periodic updates to the council during those following those meetings. So the 3 on-ramps that we identified, again, these are a continuum or a portfolio of approaches. The first is the tactical near-term advice. So climate change information can be brought into the tactical advice directly through the stock assessment. For example, you can have growth and distributions be a function of climate conditions. Climate forecasts can also be brought into that in order to understand where the species distributions might be located going forward. And the sort of closely related, the other near-term advice is through the strategic setting of targets and thresholds. So you can bring in some of these longer-term perspectives about climate conditions into setting those thresholds. And in particular, if there's information about tipping points in the system, periods of rapid change might follow a tipping point, for example, or if there are limits or thresholds that need to be brought into the management advice, we can highlight those, and that would be coming from analyses and communicated to the council to help inform the decision processes. And then finally, a lot of the climate change information is on a timescale that is beyond 2 years, sometimes 2 years all the way up to end of the century. And some of this information can be extremely helpful for longer-term strategies, thinking about potential new partnerships or communications that need to be addressed in the future if species are redistributing to different parts of the system, for example, looking for interactions maybe with things like shipping and such. And so these sorts of longer-term pieces of information can be extremely helpful for the near-term planning and also for longer-term strategic planning. So we envision that these longer-term strategic advice pieces would come in to a synthesis in this biannual climate change report that we hope to produce in a few iterations, and so we can see how the information flows from there and differs from the current SAFE reports. The sorts of information that we plan to review are very diverse. They range from things like integrated projects like ACLIME, which are looking at management strategy evaluations, climate forecasts and climate projections, and ecosystem forecasts and projections for the system, national and international assessments of adaptation options, efficacy and feasibility, and multiple knowledge sources from traditional knowledge and local knowledge as well. We hope to use many of these different sources of information to help map out what potential climate adaptation tools might be available to the council for consideration. And we've started summarizing some of these. There is a draft table that we're working on. And just to give a little more flavor for what that might look like, we've provided 3 kind of comparative examples here the sorts of information that can go into an adaptation table. And this will be a dynamic table we intend to update regularly and keep adding to as more information becomes available. And they will range in terms of tools that might be real-time, near real-time, so things that help minimize risk within the season, all the way to longer term. And we've provided a couple examples here from ones that are operational presently. So on the left-hand side, there's a tool that's called EcoCast, which provides real-time risk bycatch maps for the California current fisheries. And these maps then allow fishers to avoid high bycatch areas, minimizing the impacts of climate-induced risk of increasing bycatch. This is similar to some of the products provided presently by Seastate, and there's increasing ecological forecasts that are coming available through some projects, including Bering Seasons project at the Alaska Center. Sort of intermediate to this are things like climate-enhanced stock assessment models. We've been looking at quite a few of these through the Alaska Climate Integrated Modeling Project to evaluate their performance, their skill, when do they work best? Are there times when these maybe perform better than status quo models? And so these range of climate-enhanced stock assessment models could be reviewed through the council process and included to help with things like climate-induced changes in productivity and growth and distribution. And then the longer-term tools might involve things like projections of different conditions that affect multi-sectors. And so there's some examples here provided for how this information can be used to help navigate cooperation and synergies across multiple sectors operating in an area and enhance the blue economy. So the plan is to map these potential tools and actions into this dynamic table, which we'll provide regularly as part of our updates. And this will comprise a sort of portfolio of tools that might be available for the Bering Sea fisheries management decisions. And we plan to organize these into near-term, medium-term, and long-term, tactical and strategic sort of applications. The other thing that Diana mentioned that we've done is we've created a live glossary of terms. So the work plan itself is very technical. Defining the variety of terms that come up as we start doing this work is helpful, and so we're keeping track of that in this live glossary of terms, and this can be a resource as well to help disentangle all of the acronym soup that we often produce as part of these sorts of efforts. As we wrapped up our meeting, we identified a few additional things that we want to address looking forward. In particular, coordination with the FEP team and the products that are being developed there. Obviously, that makes a lot of sense to coordinate on those items, on the reports, on the timing, and also on things like the climate indicators, the indicators that are climate change specific. We have a plan for doing that. We also talked about what the climate briefings will look like, and I didn't talk too much about those today, but this is a method of onboarding some information that maybe isn't already coming through current workshops and briefings and reports. And so we're continuing to develop that. We hope to have some discussions between now and the fall to add a little bit of clarity about where this can add value added. We also discussed defining these on-ramps across the CCTF, but also the other task force and FEP components. And then, as we mentioned, we're working on co-generating these indicators that are mutual to both the FEP and climate change task force reports. And with that, I think that's the last slide. So I'll go ahead and stop there. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Holzman. Any questions from council members? Ms. Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Dr. Holtzman. I think I have a question on your part of the presentation, the slide you just finished, actually. And I wanted to ask a little bit. I should have probably asked Dr. Aiden when he was there. I'm wondering about the indicator development, and I'm sorry if I missed it earlier, but can you just give me a little more information on the discussion about the possible subgroup across the task force and the FEP? Because the question came up in my mind when Dr. Aiden was talking about the indicators and how very important those would be, and just wondering what the task force discussed in terms of the process to do that. And it sounds like you said that a little bit, but can you just give me a little more insight into that last bullet on the slide?
Yeah, essentially the indicator development is iterative, and so there's quite a bit of back and forth that happens as those indicators are scoped and evaluated and collected, and a subset of those may fit the criteria for usefulness, and so some of that has to do with how long the indicators time series is and what regions they apply to and things like that. And so we just identified that there was a subgroup of folks that might need to meet more regularly than our quarterly climate change task force, probably communicating by email mostly, but just to kind of move this piece forward that can take you want to do it correctly, and so you want to have enough communication back and forth, and doing that across the entire teams isn't always the most efficient manner.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Baker. Mr. Twice.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Dr. Holtzman, again, maybe, as Ms. Baker said, maybe this is also a question for Dr. Aiden, too. But following up on Ms. Baker's question, I think there's a lot of interest in getting going on indicators, and so appreciate the impetus here. Just wondering a little bit, though, about when we chose members of the task forces, I don't know that we were really thinking about their expertise in indicators. In particular, I think when we chose members of the LKTKS task force, we were thinking largely about their expertise in handling those three types of data and in terms of synthesizing those, and not as much in terms of what might be useful indicators in those data. And is that an issue that has come up for the climate change task force as well? And do you have any sort of thoughts about that? And if Dr. Aiden wants to weigh in, I'd appreciate his thoughts too.
Through the chair, yeah. So I would like to hear Karen's thoughts on this as well. But real quickly, I do want to say that I think that the task force is able to evaluate these indicators absolutely and select them. It is an iterative process, group process for selecting those eventually for the FEP, and the FEP team is leading that. So we're in the process through the task force of identifying potential indicators and looking at which of the objectives they map to and could inform. And it's a pretty important process in terms of reviewing existing information about climate impacts and things as well. So I think it's within the purview of what we're hoping to do, and it's not an additional amount of work, if that makes sense.
Yeah, this is through the chair. Just to add, this is something we actually talked about a fair amount in our workshop, and our approach, our initial approach, we divided for the objectives into sub teams, and there were only maybe 2 or 3 members for the core FEP team. And these sub teams are sort of going to be the points of contacts going forward. And I'm sorry, I didn't prepare a list of names or how those were divided out. But one of the very first things that we said was that we are going to need to reach out to other expertise. We don't have all of the people in the room. We do feel comfortable that once data is brought, that this is a group that can put this together and synthesize it. There's a good scientific expertise. But I think we want to cast a wide net while recognizing we also don't at the time have necessarily the resources to do whole new data collections. And that was part of the idea of the check-in on October to ask at that stage is when we would actually hope to say, here's the different indicators and data we've identified, here's the different people we've reached out to, who have we missed? And I hope that will be sufficient and will lead to a lot of good back and forth. Whether there's a place to be more formal and make sure that there are memberships on teams and connections made, I might look to advice for that. But I certainly want to make sure that we are including appropriate expertise in reaching in the right directions.
Thanks, both of you.
Any further questions? Okay, great. Thank you for the presentations. Okay, before we get into the Ecosystem Committee report, I'd like to remind members of the public, if you do wish to testify, to please sign up soon to do so. So I think we have Steve McLean to give us the ecosystem report on this. Mr. McLean.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon. Again, this is Steve McLean. I am council staff for the Ecosystem Committee, and I will give you that part of the Ecosystem Committee report relating to the Bering Sea FEP team report and the FEP Climate Change Task Force report. So the Ecosystem Committee did receive that same report, or similar report, from Ms. Diana Evans and Dr. Kara Maiden from their meeting that occurred on May 24, 25, 2021. So we heard this very shortly after their meeting. The committee was very appreciative of the work that the FEP team has done to respond to the recommendations from the committee and the council, around language and then also organizationally. After the report, much of the committee discussion focused on the future work of the FEP team. One committee member in particular noted that the FEP team, Ecosystem Committee, and other advisory bodies do work at the pleasure of the council and questions whether the council has requested that the FEP team consider additional FEPs or action modules that the team might be considering. The committee member also expressed concern with the FEP team managing the work of existing and future task forces. They indicated that they weren't sure that that was included in the original list of tasks that the FEP team might take up. The committee was in general agreement that a joint meeting of the FEP team and the Ecosystem Committee would be useful to coordinate and provide consistent input to the council. And the committee specifically requested that the council authorize a joint meeting between the FEP team and the Ecosystem Committee, and suggested that March 2022, when the FEP team is next having their annual meeting, would be an appropriate time for that. Moving on, one committee member noted that an action that is happening largely outside of the fishery management arena is now a global focus on biodiversity conservation, and noted that the second objective of the FEP does include consideration of biodiversity. That committee member was concerned that the biodiversity goal of the FEP was not well articulated, and that fishery management actions in general do get very poor consideration for biodiversity conservation, although many of the actions taken by councils and other fishery management organizations do promote effective biodiversity conservation. That committee member recommended that the FEP team, the Ecosystem Committee, and the council should be very careful and demonstrate that the EBFM, the Ecosystem-Based Fishery Management, can be a better way to go about protecting oceans and biodiversity than is currently portrayed by those advocating for strict closure areas. The committee member felt that it was likely to be the most important thing occurring in changing the face of fishing in the next few years, and they were concerned that thoughtful development of the FEP objective should take place. Another committee member generally agreed, but also noted that the common goals of biodiversity sustainability, and vibrant fisheries and coastal communities are not exclusive. They have suggested that the identification of ecosystem indicators, as discussed previously, is very important and should proceed such that the Council and the public will be well informed of the biodiversity conservation, fisheries, sustainability, and community benefits of EBFM. For the Bering Sea FTP Climate Task Force, the committee received that presentation from Dr. Diana Stram and Dr. Kirsten Holzman, presenting their overview of the Climate Change Task Force work plan and a summary of progress to date. The committee noted and is very appreciative that the CCTF has responded to the recommendations from the Ecosystem Committee and Council to make the product more friendly for general users, and also appreciated adding the industry representative to the CCTF. And the committee also appreciated and agreed with the proposed regular 6-month updates to the committee. Much of the discussion related to the Climate Change Task Force focused on the development of the FEP climate indicators. One committee member encouraged the task force to consider local indicators as well as general ecosystem indicators, stating that the local impacts are often important for residents of Northern Bering Sea region, but not always considered in a large ecosystem level context. The committee as a whole recognized the importance of indicators, but then there was also some discussion about the ways that indicators are developed and how they'll be integrated into the work of the task force, the local traditional knowledge subsistence task force, and the BSFEP team. One committee member noted that the LKTKS task force membership was selected by the council to meet specific objectives of the task force, and developing indicators was not part of the original objectives approved by the council. Another committee member noted that the discussion of indicators has been happening for several years, including the potential development of an action module specifically to develop indicators for the BSFEP. That member stressed that the development of indicators is imperative to be considered for ecosystem health and encouraged the committee and the council to have that discussion sooner than later. Other committee members noted that there is a difference in the progress between the CCTF and the LKTKS task forces, and questioned whether that LKTKS task force should spend the time developing indicators before they have developed the on-ramps for information integration was completed. The CCTF co-chairs did state that the CCTF plans an iterative process, as has been discussed, to develop these indicators that will include opportunities for public input and opportunity for review and revision by the Ecosystem Committee and the Council. They noted that the COVID-19 pandemic slowed much of the work of each task force and affected their progress in different ways, but the co-chairs did feel that their indicator identification process would not impede with the other team's progress, but would strengthen the process by borrowing from the expertise of the other team. And that does conclude the Ecosystem Committee report related to the Bering Sea FEP and Climate Change Task Force.
We'll go to questions here in a second. I want to offer Mr. Twyton this opportunity to provide comments.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I don't have anything to add.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Twyton. Kimball. Kimball, did you have a question? We might have a muting issue.
Can you hear me now?
We can.
Okay, sorry about that there. Mr. McLean, I was just trying to work through your comments. Did the Ecosystem Committee recommend working on FEP indicators through these teams, or did they not recommend that?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Kimball. The Ecosystem Committee did not specifically make a recommendation about working through those indicators, but since we received the presentations in the reverse order you did, that was one of the discussion points that came up related to the joint meeting between the committee and the SEP team. So they thought that would be one of the discussion points that could be considered at that joint meeting, and they would be able to provide additional advice then to the council after that joint meeting.
Okay, I understand. Thank you.
Thanks, Ms. Kimball. Further questions for Mr. McLean? All right, thank you, Mr. McLean. And Ms. Evans, I believe that takes care of everything we were going to cover under this presentation. Is that correct?
Mr. Chair, yes, that is correct.
Okay, great. Let's refresh my browser here and see if anybody has signed up to testify, and it doesn't look like there is any testimony, public comments. So the council ready to take any action? Mr. Clayton.
Mr. Chair, I do have a motion that I can email right now to council staff, so it will probably take a minute or two.
All right. Yeah, let's just stand down come back at 3:25 Alaska time and take action.
Thanks. Just emailed it.
All right, Council, please come back to order. Okay, Mr. Twite.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do have a motion on this agenda item. My motion is that the Council commends the Bering Sea Fishery Ecosystem Plan team and the Climate Change Task Force for progress made during the May 2021 workshop and meeting. Council directs the Bering Sea FEP Plan team to incorporate the input from the Ecosystem Committee and the SSC and continue the work as outlined in the presentation, including the development of ecosystem indicators to inform an ecosystem health or evaluation report, and continued coordination with the Bering Sea FEP Action Module task forces. The Council supports the milestones and timeline developed for the Climate Change Task Force work plan. The Council authorizes a joint meeting of the FEP team and the Ecosystem Committee in spring of 2022 to coordinate and provide consistent input to the Council. And with a second, I can speak to my motion.
Is there a second?
Second, if you didn't hear it, Balsiger.
Thank you, Dr. Balsiger. Mr. Twite.
Thank you, Dr. Balsiger. Important progress has been made in advancing the work and the goals of the Bering Sea FEP. This work should continue to be supported, especially as it relates to the development of ecosystem indicators, as it is integral to the Council's ability for adaptive management under future ecosystem changes. The identification of ecosystem indicators is important and should proceed such that the Council and the public will be informed of the biodiversity conservation, fishery sustainability, and community benefits of ecosystem-based fishery management. The Ecosystem Committee and the SSC had useful input for the design of the indicator report that the team should incorporate as development proceeds. The Climate Change Task Force has responded to recommendations from the Ecosystem Committee and the Council to make the product more friendly for general users and to add an industry representative to the task force. The Council is interested in reviewing the task force thoughts about operationalizing their work post-2025. The Council supports the task force's plan to develop indicators as part of an iterative process that will include public input and opportunity for review and revision. There was discussion at both the SSC and the Ecosystem Committee as to whether and when the Council should begin planning for future action modules or ecosystem-based fishery management work in other Council ecosystems, such as the Gulf. The Council continues to place highest priority on the work of the two task forces and suggests that it is premature to begin to consider other modules or other paths at this time. The Council supports the Ecosystem Committee's request to hold a joint meeting with the Bering Sea Plan team once we can resume in-person meetings. In the past, such joint meetings have been successful to improve coordination and increase understanding between the members of the FEP team and the committee about the Council's ecosystem-based fishery management goals and intentions and work underway at the Alaska Fisheries Science Center and elsewhere.
Thank you, Mr. Twite. Are there any questions for Mr. Twite on this motion? Any amendments? Okay. Any comments on the motion? Ms. Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Twite, for the motion. I appreciate your continued tracking of these issues, particularly as chair of the Ecosystem Committee. I do appreciate the clarity of this motion in a couple different respects, and especially speaking to it in terms of your direction to prioritize work for the 2 existing task forces related to the FEP modules. And I think that's really helpful in terms of identifying the council's priorities. I certainly agree with those. I also appreciate your motion and speaking to the direction in terms of developing ecosystem indicators. I did take note of that in the 2 staff presentations that we received, well, the FEP presentation and the climate change task force presentation. And then reading the ecosystem committee minutes, it's clear it's been a topic of discussion. And so I appreciated some pretty clear direction from you in terms of coming from the council in terms of how that process should proceed. So I will support this motion, thanking again the FEP team and the climate change task force for their meetings and work on this, and also the ecosystem committee for their recommendations. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Baker. Other comments on the motion? Mr. Twite.
Just wanted to thank Ms. Baker for her kind words, but acknowledge that any clarity in the motion was the result of the combined efforts of Dr. Ike, Dr. Stram, and Ms. Evans.
Thank you, Mr. Twite. Okay. There's no additional comments. We can go to a vote. Is there any opposition? No opposition. The motion passes unanimously. Thank you, Mr. Twite. Anything further under D3? Okay. All right, great. Well, thanks, everybody. Let's go ahead and call it a day here. We come back tomorrow morning at 8:30 Alaska time, and we will finish up with staff tasking. See it at 8:30 Alaska time.
The conference call is now ending.